little bit higher? Oh, Joe, you are a miracle worker. I'm Peter Pell Center. I'm going to tell you something I've never admitted publicly before, but I'd be a fraud and a liar if tonight's presentation were to occur and I didn't say something. I suffer. Suffer is the right term from post-traumatic stress syndrome. I've been in treatment for a long time now. I don't know if it ever will go away. That's why, even though it's a smaller crowd than we normally have, why tonight's presentation is so important. Because it's possible to disappear in society and appear like you're normal, but it's not. You carry these wounds. Those of you remember General Romeo Dallaire, which is the highest ranking military officer to admit to post-traumatic stress syndrome, calls it his wound. And he comes down regularly from Quebec to receive his treatment. And that's what it is. It's a wound. Judith Broder was ready for another career called retirement when she took on her new purpose. I knew within the first 5 seconds of speaking with her that I found someone incredibly special. And I'll tell you that that's why I'm sad that it's a smaller audience than normal, because I think this is probably the most important presentation of the season, if not ever, at the Pell Center. There are a lot of folks, a lot of loved colleagues who are out there who cannot get normal help through the channels. They're afraid of hurting their security clearances, not getting promoted. The idea that this is a wimp disease, I'm telling you, it's not a wimp disease. To have the courage and go out and care about others. Now, I will say there are members of my own class called Why We Fight, Violence and the Roots of Western Civilization. We've been studying this semester, and we're examining this question. And it's a really, really painful question, because why we fight is also a question about how we live, or how we should live our lives, and what we should be honest enough to admit to others. So I'm telling you something that's probably the most personal thing I've ever told anyone in my life, because I'm honored and privileged to have Judith Broder to speak to us tonight. Please welcome her.
Wow, I don't know who that is that he's describing, but it brings tears to my eyes. And I just have to say, even before this introduction, I'm deeply honored to speak tonight to you here at the Pell Center about the hidden wounds of war, the psychological and spiritual crises. It's especially meaningful to me because I have been for years an admirer of Senator Claiborne Pell for his advocacy for those among us who don't have the resources to pay for a college education, and for his outspoken criticism of the Vietnam War. A few years ago, I would never have imagined I would be speaking on this topic, so I'd just like to tell you a little bit about my journey. I was for many years a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst in private practice, active in teaching residents and analytic candidates. I loved my work and felt privileged to be able to do this work, which was gratifying and from which I learned something new almost daily from my patients. I was and am now also someone interested and engaged in our national political process. I felt concerned as we were becoming increasingly drawn into the global war on terror, and I wasn't sure how to best express my concern. In this personal context of dis-ease, I saw a theater performance of a play written by a then active duty Marine, Hughes. It was called The Sandstorm, Stories from the Front. And it was in essence 10 monologues from a group of Marines whom he was deployed with in Fallujah. And these were men at that time, so although there now, of course, are women who are in the same situation. This play was a life-changing experience for me. These young men spoke from their hearts and their guts about what they had seen, what they had done, and especially how they felt at the time. Their language was direct and shocking. They spoke the unspeakable. They spoke about the pleasure they felt in killing, the joy of revenge, and the horror they felt at discovering that the mound of rags at the side of the road that they had shot at was a 7-year-old boy. Equally disturbing were their stories of the psychological reverberations of their combat experiences. For me, what was most distressing was learning about the extent of their guilt and self-hatred and how alienated and isolated they felt coming home. It was clear to me that returning to civilian life was going to be a different kind of battle, no less fraught than fighting in Fallujah. I left the theater shaking and in tears. People asked me if I had a family member in Iraq, and to my own surprise, I answered, no, but all these young men are my sons and brothers. I knew I had to do something for them because I could see that these Marines were not mentally ill. They did not have major depression or post-traumatic stress disorder or personality disorder. These were, in quotes, ordinary Marines, although I don't think any Marines are ordinary, suffering from the psychic consequences of combat. A catastrophic undoing of character that had shattered their moral compass. The following morning, this sounds corny, but this is really the truth. I awoke with a plan of what has now, 5 years later, become the Soldiers Project. In brief, it encompasses the following: the provision of free, unlimited, confidential, easily accessible psychotherapy in the private offices of licensed mental health professionals. I knew that there were many people who were being excluded from the existing services, some on the basis of what Peter spoke about, the stigma about getting mental health help, but others because they weren't eligible, like gay and lesbians, like grandparents, like brothers and sisters who were suffering terribly because they had loved ones who'd been deployed. So free, unlimited, and a wide safety net. In-depth training for the volunteers who were going to be treating these men and women and their families about the relevant issues in military culture, combat trauma, the deployment cycle, etc. The third part of this was peer support, consultation groups for the therapists. I was aware of how I was affected from 1 2-hour immersion in the psychological horrors that our men and women had gone through. And I knew that anyone who was going to be able to be there in a significant way for the people that they would be treating, they would need support themselves so they wouldn't be traumatized or withdraw from the pain. So peer groups for our therapists. Another aspect of this is to educate the community regarding the psychological consequences of war. I don't know if you know, but it is a minute number of our population who are engaged in this war. It's a volunteer army. It's very easy for people to close their eyes, ears, and hearts to the suffering of those people who served. So I felt as if I needed to let our communities know what was happening so that they could be informed, and you can be informed about, before you send anyone to war, you need to know what the cost is going to be. The other part of what I wanted to do and have done, which is to establish liaisons with anyone who supports our troops, and that means the Veterans Administration, the vet centers, Gold Star and Blue Star mothers, Iraq Vets Against the War, anyone. Again, broadly based. So this project has in some way become my life. We have now over 400 mental health professionals in several cities throughout the country, and we have provided thousands of hours of free psychotherapy. This is important. I need you to understand that I really don't consider myself extraordinary. I'm just a citizen who became aware of a need, and I decided to, in the words that Senator Pell considered his creed, translate ideas into action and help people. For this talk, I found as my inspiration the poems and writings and conversations of those who have seen the war firsthand and who have the ability to bring us face to face with the profound disruptions war brings. This will be a painful talk. It's the only way I know of showing you what war looks like, psychically and spiritually. My purpose is not to upset you, but rather to disturb you and educate you so that you as citizens will be in a position, and again in Senator Pell's words, to translate ideas into action and help people. I'll begin with two quotations. The first is by J.D. Salinger in his novel As a Mate with Love and Squalor. It's a novel which includes the following description, which is presumed to be based on his experiences following his military service. I quote, "He tries to read, but the sentences don't hold together. He opens letters left lying on his desk for weeks and then tears them to shreds before completing them. He chain smokes. The light of the sun or bowl burns his eyes. He doesn't wash. He doesn't fraternize. He doesn't clean his room. He never leaves it either. He can't stop trembling. He feels his mind dislodge itself and teeter like insecure luggage on an overhead rack. He squeezes his temples and holds on tightly." My next quote is from the novel The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, a Vietnam War veteran. I consider this one of the most powerful books that's ever been written about combat, and it's an easy read. This is a quote. "They carried all the emotional baggage of men who might die: grief, terror, love, longing. These were intangibles, but the intangibles had their own mass and specific gravity. They had tangible weight. They carried shameful memories. They carried the common secret of cowardice, barely restrained, the instinct to run or freeze or hide. And in many respects, this was the heaviest burden of all, for it could never be put down. It required perfect balance. And then, this is also by O'Brien, a true war story is never moral. It does not instruct nor encourage virtue, nor suggest models of behavior, nor restrain men from doing the things that men have always done. If a story seems moral, do not believe it. If at the end of a story you feel uplifted, then you've made a victim of a very old and terrible lie. There is no rectitude. There is no virtue. You can tell a war story by its absolute allegiance to obscenity and evil. You can tell a true war story if it embarrasses you. If you don't care for obscenity, you don't care for truth. Send guys to war, they come home talking dirty. These are hard things to take in. And this is from a man whom I met early on in my journey to learn about what war is like and for those who served. He wrote me an email and he said, all the troops come home different from when they left. They will never be the same again, ever. They will carry the war with them for the rest of their lives. Much of what a returning serviceman or woman carries is hidden, even from him or herself. And finally, this is a poem by William Butler Yeats called The Second Coming. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. I hope these quotations, if they haven't completely turned you off, will act as an introduction to my topic, which is the psychological and spiritual crises of war. Things fall apart. They cannot hold. Under the trauma of combat, what falls apart is our unconscious system of beliefs about the world as a stable, predictable, and safe place. In our daily life, it is this set of beliefs that we take for granted and which allows us to function in society. In combat, there is a massive loss of innocence. These beliefs are shattered. Our troops come face to face with their existential vulnerability and aggression. Death and loss loom as constant threats. As background, it's important to understand that our military service men and women are at present all volunteers. Most have joined the service as idealistic young men and women, determined to defend and preserve the values we hold so dear. They may not have expected to see combat, nor did they expect to be deployed multiple times in often shockingly unfamiliar conditions. Many are very young, still adolescents developmentally. On the other hand, 50% of our troops that have been deployed are National Guard and reservists. They are often mature men and women with established civilian careers, living in our communities throughout our country. This is now more about the background. Our servicemen and women go through intense training to prepare them for battle. This training requires that they set aside many of the moral and ethical principles that were central to their upbringing and common to us all. For example, the common commandment, thou shalt not kill. Love thy neighbor as thyself. You need to understand that without this training and without this new battle mind psychological template, they could not survive, nor could they do what we require of them, that is to carry out the mission of defending our country. This is a quotation from Richard Gabriel, a former intelligence officer in the Pentagon, from his book, No More Heroes. War has simply become too stressful for even the strongest among us to stand for very long. Men are crushed by the strain of war. All men are at risk of becoming psychiatric casualties. There is no such thing as getting used to combat. No man in battle is really sane. The mindset of a soldier on the battlefield is a highly disturbed mind, and those who are not afflicted by it die very quickly. Now, I hope you understand, he is not saying that our service members are disturbed people, but in order to survive, they must find a different way of being that in ordinary civilian society would be considered very disturbed. Just recently I read about a study that examined the mental health impact of direct and indirect killing among approximately 3,000 returning soldiers from Operation Iraqi Freedom. Data were collected from a post-deployment screening program. Over 40% of the soldiers reported killing or being responsible for killing during their deployment. Even in the study, after controlling for combat exposure, killing was a significant predictor of post-traumatic stress disorder, alcohol abuse, anger, and relationship problems. Military personnel from modern deployments are at risk of adverse mental health conditions and related psychosocial functioning related to killing in war. This is a scientific study that underlines that for us, killing, no matter what the reasons are, takes its toll on us psychologically. So now I'd like to tell you as best I can, without having been there, what our service members face in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's no front line. That is, there is no identifiable, uniform, opposing army. This means that every stranger is a potential threat. That includes old people, pregnant women, children. Our troops may be at risk of death 24/7. There are extreme conditions of heat and cold. Temperatures within a Humvee may reach over 140 degrees. They must wear gas masks, and of course, they cannot lift their heads up for air without exposing themselves to sniper fire. One of the young men that we saw talked about his claustrophobia, that he was so terrified being enclosed in this Humvee with these high temperatures with the mask on that he couldn't stand it, and he just pulled his mask off. And he knew he could die, but he felt if he couldn't do that, he would die. The troops are isolated from their family and friends. Ordinary situations are often dangerous. As an example, in the midst of a therapy session in suburban Los Angeles, a young Marine jumped from his chair, ran to the door, and began shaking. When the therapist was able to help him calm down, she asked him what had happened. He said, the dogs. I just heard a dog bark. I love dogs. In Iraq, we had to kill the dogs. If they barked, they might reveal our position, and snipers could get us. Iraq and Afghanistan present our troops with evidence of extreme poverty, unlike what we're familiar with here in the United States. There are children wearing rags, without shoes, and hungry. There are cities in which block after block after block, there's only rubble. The trauma of these conditions is multiplied by repeat deployments, sometimes as many 5 to 6, and sometimes, although I don't think this is true any longer, lasting as long as 15 months. Under these conditions, a significant number of our troops suffer what I'm calling psychological and spiritual injuries. Many of these injuries can be understood as variations of loss. We hear a lot about post-traumatic stress, but I want you to understand that loss is central to much of what now is called stress. Among the losses are the following: the loss of bodily integrity through physical injuries. This is obvious, but the loss of limbs, of eyesight, and especially following traumatic brain injuries, what is called the signature wound of this war, deprive people of the ability to rely on their own mental functioning. The loss of brothers in arms through death and injury. The loss of companionship with family and community. The loss of time. That means missing out on the important experiences with their children, birthdays, ball games, first communions, recitals, and especially the actual birth of children conceived while on leave or prior to deployment. The loss of the sense of personal safety in the world. The loss of the belief of the goodness of man. The loss of self-respect, the awareness of their own fears, their cowardice, but especially related to the fact that doing harm to others leaves one feeling diminished in oneself. The loss of religious beliefs based on the repeated experiences of, quote, evil, both in terms of the necessary killings that they have committed and the violations of the Judeo-Christian ethics familiar to most of us. A loss of the ability to love, which may follow the battle mind training, which of necessity destroys the awareness of the other's humanity. It's very, very difficult to kill someone if you see him or her as someone like yourself. So you have to dehumanize them to be able to do this. I'll get to this later, but the problem is this battle line psychology can't be turned off just like a switch. And when you come home, what saved you on the battlefield is detrimental in returning into our civilian communities. These are some of the inevitable consequences of serving in combat. What we have come to call Post-traumatic stress disorder or combat stress reaction begins, in fact, with what is a normal human reaction to an abnormal situation that's called war. The psychological troubles begin with coming home. We are now just beginning to understand that the transition from war to civilian life is complex and may take an extended period of time. So, although our veterans may be physically home, they may remain frozen in the war zone, unable to make the transition back. The very adaptations necessary to survive in war become maladaptive at home. For example, prolonged combat brings about bodily changes that deaden pain, hunger, and desire. This leads to an emotional deadness and indifference to the experience of everyday life. In combat, anyone may be an enemy, and trust in one's neighbor's goodwill will be replaced by fear and suspicion. The core feature of the injury, and I call it an injury or a wound, not a disease, that's called combat stress, is that our ordinary, unquestioned assumption that we have some control over our minds is severely fractured. A vivid example of this is what we call triggers. These are sensory experiences that set off the reliving of traumatic moments, and they abound in daily life. The dog barking would be an example of it. They may be smells, sounds, the way the beach looks, the bark of a dog, etc. They cannot be avoided. It's part of everyday life. Perception is altered. A box by the side of the road may appear to be a bomb. Many of our patients are unable, and I'm from Los Angeles, to drive on freeways beneath overpasses because what they see are IEDs, improvised explosive devices, or snipers on the bridges. This is an issue if you want to provide treatment for people, because you actually have to be able to provide therapists who are close enough that our returning veterans can get to without being exposed to the re-experience of trauma. The triggers may lead to flashbacks in which the traumatic experience is relived, not remembered. There's a difference. The parents of an Army Ranger came to us in extreme distress, wanting help in understanding what was happening to their son. One evening after a family dinner, 2 weeks after returning from his third deployment, he began racing around the backyard screaming, "Get down, get down, get down! They're here, get down!" He fell to the ground, poised with an imaginary rifle. He was sweating, panting, and crying. They were understandably terrified, but they were able to stay with him and slowly pull him back from the state he was in which he was actually reliving his trauma. They're a family that we were able to help by helping them understand what it was that he was going through so they could be with him and not be as terrified as they understandably were. The veterans are often in a state of hypervigilance in which they are continuously mobilized for anticipated danger. This, of course, leads to serious sleep disturbances as they are afraid to go to sleep and be vulnerable to either external attack or the recurrence of horrible nightmares related to their combat experiences. This hypervigilance state which is necessary for survival in combat, when prolonged, may lead to physical symptoms such as headaches, palpitations, and fatigue. We are now seeing an increasing number of what are called psychosomatic illnesses that represent the expression of the unremembered trauma in the body. Withdrawal and isolation are other expressions of a combat stress injury. Families talk about the 1,000-yard stare, where although their son or husband is physically present, his mind is somewhere else. Other significant expressions of what's called combat stress are a loss of, did I lose the, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Are a loss of a sense of well-being, of confidence, of satisfaction in everyday life. A sense of isolation, safe attachments to persons other than combat veterans are not possible. And most devastating of all, there's a destruction of values, ideals, and ambitions, followed by the inevitable feeling of despair. Jonathan Shea, a psychiatrist and author of 2 seminal books about war. One is called Achilles in Vietnam, and the other is Odysseus in America. These books are based on his 20 years of experience treating Vietnam veterans in the Veterans Administration. Calls The Undoing of Character. This is his quote from a Vietnam vet in his book. I was just a typical American boy. I had strong religious beliefs. I wasn't an angel, but evil didn't enter until Vietnam. I wasn't prepared for it. What I did, it was like it was somebody else. War changes you, strips you of all your beliefs, your religion, your dignity, takes your dignity away. You become an animal. I look back today and I'm horrified at what I turned into, what I was, what I did. You know, it's unbelievable what humans can do to each other. I never in a million years thought I would be capable of that. Never, never, never. Our servicemen and women experience a profound spiritual and moral conflict over the atrocities they've seen and that they have participated in. There is often an intense experience of pleasure at killing one's enemy, especially if this is in response to the death or injury of a brother in arms. This is again from the things they carried. War is hell, but that's not the half of it, because war is also mystery and terror and adventure and courage and discovery and holiness and pity and despair and longing and love. War is nasty. War is fun. War is thrilling. War is drudgery. War makes you mad. War makes you dead. In truth, war is also beauty. For all its horror, you can't help but gape at the awful majesty of combat. At its core, perhaps, war is just another name for death, and yet any soldier will tell you, if he tells the truth, that the proximity to death begins with a corresponding proximity to life. After a firefight, there is always an immense pleasure of aliveness. War has the feel, the spiritual texture of a great ghostly fog, thick and permanent. There is no clarity. The old rules are no longer binding. The old truths are no longer true. Right spills over into wrong. Order blends into chaos, love into hate, ugliness into beauty, law into anarchy, civility into savagery. In war, you lose your sense of the definite, hence your sense of truth itself. And this is another Vietnam veteran quoted in Jonathan Shea's book. I felt betrayed. I lost all my mercy. I built up such hate. It got worse as time went on. I really loved fucking killing. Couldn't get enough. For every one that I killed, I felt better. Made some of the hurt go away. It got very hard, cold, merciless. In most cases, in the aftermath of these actions, the feeling of repulsion at this pleasure emerges. Our troops feel as if they're not fit to live amongst us, that they will infect us with the horrors if they tell us the truth of war. So what follows is disturbed and disturbing behavior. They withdraw from family and friends, use drugs, seek danger by racing cars and getting into fights, and ultimately perhaps rejoining the military because it's the only place they feel at home with their buddies who have been through hell with them. In that regard, it is vitally important that we recognize and appreciate the intensity and quality of the emotional connection our veterans feel with each other. These intense attachments are equivalent to those of our earliest years. They are the mortar that binds together the band of brothers. They are equivalent to those of a mother to her infant or child. The troops watch over each other in the way a mother watches over and feels responsible for her children. When a buddy is injured or killed, the emotional impact is like that of a loss or injury or death of a child to a parent. If you ask them, most service members will say that what motivates them to go on in battle is not the mission, which is what they might have signed up for, but their care for their brothers and sisters in arms. It's very personal. When a buddy is injured or killed, the intensity of grief and rage is profound. And on the battlefield, there's no safe time for grieving. The ethos of battle is to suck it up. It's survival. Rage emerges in the place of grief and alternates with states of emotional numbness or deadness. A common theme we hear is, don't get sad, get even. This is from the novel All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque, who was a German soldier in World War I. I'm reading these things because you need to appreciate that this is not only about Iraq and Afghanistan, this is about war. So this is his quote. The terror of the front seeks deep down. We make grim, coarse jests about it when a man dies. As long as we take it that way, we may maintain our own resistance. But we do not forget. We are in good humor because otherwise we should go to pieces. But our humor becomes more bitter every month. And this I know. All these things that now seek down in us like stone after the war shall waken again, and then shall begin the disentanglement of life and death. We will not be able to find our way anymore. The enormity of the guilt of our troops, felt by our troops, cannot be underestimated. Over and over and over we hear, it should have been me. I'm no hero. My brother who died was a hero. So, welcome home parades and celebrations paradoxically often increase the feelings of isolation and alienation for returning troops because they reify the gap between the soldier's internal experience as unworthy and even evil and the expectations of family and community. Given this spiritual moral fracture, it's no surprise that we're seeing a startling rise in suicide among combat veterans. In 2000, this is an amazing figure, horrifying. In 2009, the number of suicide in active duty personnel exceeded the number of combat deaths in Afghanistan. And this is active duty. And for every active duty death, there were 5 additional men or women who had been hospitalized for suicide attempts. This does not take into account those who have been, I'm blocking on the word, discharged from the service and in the year or 2 after commit suicide or make an attempt. I just read today on the internet this poem, which will give you a sense of what I'm talking about. It's written by Michael Turner, who's a former Marine, now 26 years old. He served 2 deployments in Iraq, and he made 2 serious suicide attempts. He's alive and is recovered and has become a poet. This is part of a poem called A Night in the Mind of Me. The train hits you head on when you hear of another friend whose life was just taken, pulling his cold, lifeless body from the cooler, unzipping the bag and seeing his forehead crushed like a cereal bowl from a sniper's bullet that touched his brain. His skin was pale and cold. It becomes difficult to sleep even after being physically drained from patrols, post, overwatches, and carrying 500 sandbags up 80 feet of stairs after each post cycle. The psychiatrists still wonder why we drink heavily when we get home. We need something to take us away from the gunfire, explosions, sand, nightmares, and screams. I still can't cry. The tears build up, but no way to shed. Anger kicks in, and something else becomes broken. A cabinet, an empty bottle of liquor, a heart, a soul. People still look away as we submit ourselves to drug and alcohol and suppress these feelings of loneliness and sadness, leading to self-mutilation and self-destruction on the gift of a human body. The ditch that we dug starts to cave in. So suicide may be an expression of profound hopelessness and isolation. It may also be a kind of self-execution for perceived moral failings. It may be driven by a desire to rejoin brothers who have died in battle. Here's another poem. In a way, I'm sorry to do this to you, but I need to do it to you. This is by Camilo Bica. He's a former Marine, but he is now a professor of ethics at the School of Visual Arts in New York. He's a doctorate. But you wouldn't know this from this poem. The monster and I are one. I have feasted upon the flesh of decaying corpses, and with their blood have quenched my thirst. The transformation is complete, and I can never return. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. I realize that I've painted a pretty grim picture of the hidden injuries of our combat veterans. And yet, as a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, I believe that as citizens and healers, we can reach out and help our soldiers find a way all the way home. Jonathan Shea writes that the act of war generates a profound gulf between the combatant and the community. The veteran carries the taint of the killer. Shea stresses the importance for all of the citizenry to participate in what he calls purification rituals, as in ancient times, to purify all who have participated in war on our behalf. This suggestion addresses head-on the necessity of relieving the often overwhelming personal sense of guilt of our service members, as well as the extreme alienation and isolation our troops often feel upon the return to civilian life. Nietzsche has written, "That which does not kill us makes us stronger." Unfortunately, this is not always the case, but it is true in certain instances. Recovery from the psychological and spiritual injuries of war can lead to personal growth. I've tried to describe the vital importance of attachments between service members on the field of battle. Coming home represents a loss of those profound connections. Central to healing and growth is the establishment of new powerful bonds of human understanding within the civilian community. These may be to family, old friends, new friends, therapists, religious advisors, teachers, physicians. What is essential for this to work is that we, as ordinary citizens of our country, must be able to bear witness to the suffering of our combat veterans. This means that we must ourselves be able to feel and bear the intense grief of the multiple losses suffered, the rage and despair, and we must stay connected to our veterans through what is often a prolonged and emotionally taxing process. Grieving is essential. The goal is not to forget, but rather to remember and to grieve what has been lost and cannot be recovered. This isn't easy. When this happens, though, it's often possible to rediscover the good in the world, cherished memories, relationships, and personal abilities. With this comes the development of great inner strength, self-confidence, and especially greater empathy and compassion for others. Earlier in my talk, I mentioned a play written by Hughes. His story actually follows this arc. He volunteered right after 9/11 and was an extremely dedicated and altruistic Marine. After his service, he was an angry young man. He felt betrayed by his war experiences. He felt alone, alienated, and unwilling to talk to anyone. But he had a young son, and he was a single parent of a young son. And he took over the care of this son, and he began to feel human again. From that point, he reconnected to his community, and he went on to establish a foundation for returning veterans who were interested in theater and writing, so he could help others find their way home. So in closing, I'd like to add that I'm exquisitely aware that I've said nothing about the families and loved ones of our troops. In many ways, they, no less than our veterans, bear the hidden wounds of war and suffer similar psychological and spiritual crises related to their loved ones' deployments and returns. I apologize for this omission. It in no way reflects on my feeling that their grief and pain is less worthy of our attention. We must embrace all of those touched by war in order to become more evolved and engaged citizens. My final quote comes from a man whom my granddaughter calls our greatest contemporary poet, American poet, and our worst singer, Bob Dylan. The lyrics are, "How does it feel to be on your own, with no direction home, like a complete unknown, like a rolling stone? I believe it's our obligation to do whatever we can to make sure that our returning veterans do not become rolling stones with no direction home." I thank you all for your attention.